Hi there, I'm Dr. Victoria Mattingly, and this is Better Humans at Work. On this week's episode of Better Humans at Work, Parus Nischal shares his insights on improving diversity and representation in sports and providing holistic opportunities and guidance for underrepresented developing athletes. Parus is founder and CEO of Nischal Sports Group, which specializes in scouting, developing, and representing talented and ambitious footballers across the globe. Nischal Sports Group is focused on giving confidence and support to talented players who have the drive to succeed in professional UK, European, and North American leagues. Parus and I met as fellow entrepreneurs here in the Pittsburgh area, and we've supported ourselves as we've continued to build and grow our companies. He has incredible energy, and I'm super excited to share with you today his thoughts and his amazing work in diversifying the soccer or football space. And without further ado, here is me and Parus.
Hi Parus, how are you today?
Hi Victoria, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining me and our audience for, just more examples of how we can improve the human experience at work. You have such a fascinating story and company. You and I met at a co-working space here in Pittsburgh, and we've just been like entrepreneur buddies and accountability partners. I'm just like super grateful to have you in my entrepreneur network, and just grateful for you joining us today to have this conversation. So
thank you to you too as well. And I really appreciate all the help and all the advice so far. So no, thank you.
Well, it goes both ways. Yeah. Can you share a little bit about your journey that led you to begin Nischal Sports Group?
So I'll keep it short. So I played football, soccer my whole life. And I was lucky to be scouted by a well-known coach back in the UK, and he took me to various academies in England. And at those sort of trials and these sort of times where I played with the different players and coaches, a lot of the excuses as to why I wasn't good enough were not necessarily the technical side, or more so the physical side. So they were more talking about, maybe strong enough or this and that. And I was very quick, and I had technical ability, and I, at least I felt like I had a good enough ability. But I was always sort of told that I was never big enough, which was usually the big excuse. And essentially, without sort of taking up too much of your time, essentially I tried to sort of get fit on my own. So I watched all these like Rocky Balboa movies, and I tried all these different sort of like insanity and all these different things on my own. And my parents and my siblings were extremely supportive, where anything I needed, they just let me do it. And it actually worked to a degree, but there were certain things obviously I was missing, where, those sort of methods are not necessarily scientifically proven or necessarily the right way to do it, particularly for 15 years old. And although I sort of put on the pounds, I didn't necessarily have the understanding of stretching and activation, things like that. So it wasn't necessarily the right way. But and then essentially my family moved to the United States, and the plan was to go pro to the US system. And then unfortunately, when I was 19, I had an injury in college. And essentially, all that background is really important, because what Nischal Sports Group is essentially an entity that I wish I had growing up. And I had, not just my parents and my siblings, but one of those things where the football education, soccer education, and the understanding of the body and the mental side and all these different aspects are hugely important, particularly if you don't know. So having sort of been through that journey, and not just in the UK system, but also in the American side of things, we're bringing a vast sort of level of experience to a player. So sort of fast forward from around 19, I ended up working in international tax. After 5 months, I left and I started my company. And the company are sort of three different aspects: are the scouting, the development, and representation. So one is identification of talent, the one is development of the player as well, and then the representation, which is like being the agent. And around 19, when I did get injured, is essentially when I started to have these little ideas about what could I do to help others. And so Nischal Sports Group, we scout, develop, and represent footballers. So the scouting, identification of talent, the development is the physical development as well as mental development for the players, and then the representation is self-explanatory. It's representing the player in non-football and football contracts. Essentially, I wanted something like this for myself, and I think hopefully it's, as we further progress, it becomes, the idea of what we're doing is essentially coming from exactly what I wanted. So that's where kind of the passion is driven from, really. It's essentially, it's something that I wish I had. And so I think that is a bit more powerful drive for me, providing this for players. And initially, it started off with being, because of my Indian background, Asian background. There's another thing I wanted to sort of bring up, is that there weren't many people looking like me playing. In fact, none. So it did start off initially as, and it still is, where we specialize in minority backgrounds or South Asian backgrounds, specifically, Indian, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, or, any South Asian, or anyone, but it just specifically that the culture is similar to mine. And so far, it seems that it's working, in the sense that people of various backgrounds in Asia are really sort of intrigued and want to know more about how we work. I think we're one of the very few companies that do have this holistic approach, at least with somebody looking like me, sort of driving it forward. So and so it's myself, my partner Roy Millen, who I've known since I was about 7 or 8 years old, Lewis McMillan, who's our sports scientist, and then a functional strength coach, Chris Rantes. And we have basically the 4 core people, plus a smattering of interns who come in, and I have to mention them as well, like Ian Asinio, who was our global partnership manager at the very beginning, which is where we met, I think, initially back in the co-working space. So we've had, and my siblings, and my parents, and everyone sort of, we all, at the very beginning, it's it's a team effort, you know what I mean? So to get to where we are is really special. And we're now at the point where coronavirus has caused a lot of problems in the sports world, but we're lucky to have about 6 or 7 players, not just in the men's game, we also work in the women's game as well. And we're looking to sign about 5 more this year. And we have partnerships with various sports labs, which utilize our sports science protocol. And we're looking to do various elite sort of showcases and combines, and it's getting to the point where it's going to get a bit quicker and get a bit more fast paced, which I mean it already was anyway. But now it's to the point where it just lack of sleep is definitely a frequent thing, but it's something that we continue to drive forward and push, and all the players that we have are brilliant, and doing everything they can to sort of keep their heads up in this time. And I think again, looking at the players that we do have, and what we're trying to do, it is a very difficult task, but we're getting there.
Thank you for sharing that. And something that I was so intrigued and compelled by whenever we were first getting to know each other, and I was learning about your company and what you do, was some stats that you shared with me. And so, I do a lot of work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, but I mostly focus on the inclusion side of things, the behaviors and the culture. But, the diversity part is also a really important part of the conversation and the overall equation. And the way I talk to my clients about diversity is representation, right? And so to figure out like what should be goals or objectives when it comes to how diverse a workforce should look, it's looking at that broader population, whether it's in the country, whether it's in the industry. And so you shared some stats with me that I thought were fascinating, that it was some like X% of the world is Indian. X% of professional footballers are. What are those stats to share?
So you should have told me before, I would have had them up, but roughly.
Yes.
At the time we had done, so that's actually, again, thank you for bringing that up. So I have a database that we utilize to track various players that we're interested in. And it started off as a curiosity project where it was just like, I wonder how many players out there who look like me are playing in Europe or whatever. It was a very, very simple sort of idea. And it started off with just looking in England, then looking in Scotland, then looking in maybe Germany. And then we ended up scouring about 32 leagues so far. I think it's 41,000 players that we've identified, or at least looked at, that are playing professional soccer, or at least in the academy system. I think it's from the ages of 16 up. And of those 41,000, I believe we only have just under 200 names. And those 200 are either South Asian or, barely, either Middle Eastern origin. So it's very, very low. And and this is an estimation. So it could be more, it could be less, based on who's still playing. And, as also including, we also covered 5,004 players in the NCAA Division 1 schools as well. So I think that was crazy. I think we haven't done a sort of update for this year, but I think the year before, there was about 5 or 6 sort of South Asian players in the whole of NCAA playing. And again, may have been, we may have missed something or whatever, but it was very, very small amount. But we utilize the database we have is also now use it we use it for all players. But just again, it started off as sort of a curiosity sort of thing, and it turned into sort of this really fascinating, I'm not sure it's anthropological, but sort of study that was seeing what why is that so low. And before I kind of take up again more of your time, it's a various amount of reasons as to why that is. It's systematic. It's racism in the sports world. There's cultural differences as well, and they kind of, some say they may be mutually exclusive. I don't know. I think one could be caused by another, and vice versa.
I'm sure it's interactive, right? I'm sure they're reinforcing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like
the cultural issues, all just like
it's like if you're constantly not being overlooked for something, then you're going to avoid that pathway.
Yeah, so I just did some quick math, and 200 out of 41,000 is 0.00.
Very low.
Like,
yeah, it's very low. Even if it's 1,000 people, maybe not 1,000. Even if it's 500 or 1,000, I mean, still very low.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's just a fascinating sort of understanding of the landscape of football. It's just one of those things. We knew it was low, but I think I think what causes this discussion of sort of, particularly in England, and again, Asians in England are considered South Asian. That's what they refer to them there, and so this Asian inclusion. Understand why is there lack of Asian players? The reason it's such a big problem in England is because this is one of the largest minority groups in the UK, and make up a lot of the various professions, and contribute a lot to the economy in the UK. But there's a lot of Asian boys and girls playing football at the parks and the Sunday league, and then you get to the next level, and then they also suddenly disappear.
So what happens between levels? Like what are some? Well,
that's what we're trying to, and that's essentially what is the curious factor. And it's, again, we work with any player. Doesn't matter where you're from. I don't really care, as long as you have the mentality and you have the ability and you're willing to do not exactly what we say, but more so that you're willing to follow sort of like, look, we've got the sports science, we've got the Premier League level sort of protocols and testing, and if you follow this, I'm not going to guarantee you anything, but it's going to make you better. And if they have that mentality, that's great. But I think just in terms of we're looking at in that level, it's very hard to say. And I think there's elements of culturally, it's back in the day, it was about stability. It was about coming to this country, like my grandparents, and it is I guess not cliched story, but it's a very common story where immigrants came to England with nothing and built their way up, and that is the hardest thing to do. I mean, I've moved country, and just getting a passport is a complete mess. I don't know what they did in the 50s and 60s. You know what I mean? So then we have the internet. So the difficulties that come with emigrating somewhere for a better future is wild. And so what my parents have done and put in a situation where now, I guess my generation, like, is the 90s, sort of seeing it, and then now the new generation as well, where they're not given everything, but they have an opportunity to do something different. They don't necessarily have to go into the stable professions and worry about bringing in money immediately, or there's more of an openness to it, and we're seeing that more and more and more with parents, but we're still seeing, without sort of revealing my experiences as an agent or as a sort of intermediary in the sport, we're still seeing the same excuses as to why players aren't being picked up or kept or signed on. And what I've noticed is with certain teams is, like I mentioned, my experience was, you're not big enough. I was like, well, you have a gym there, don't you? So just write me a program and I'll do it. You know what I mean? So it's just this, it's kind of like, you'd rather just get somebody who's a finished product before. And it makes sense now, because these teams in England and even in Germany, France, I mean, they're raking millions and millions of dollars. And it's almost $1 billion industry. I mean, it is a billion industry in terms of the sport world. So they're just like, it's like asset offer, for conveyor belt. Like, it's very, very sort of robotic that way. But there are a lot of people in the sport that again, for me, it's not about just including and having, it's really, again, this topic is really difficult because I don't know what equality looks like. And in fact, I don't even know if I want, I desire the meritocracy aspect, where it's like, just look at them as players. I don't really care where they're from. If they can do a good job, then they can do a good job. And that's all I really want.
Yeah.
I'm not asking for the interview or the job, or, you know what I mean? I'm not asking you to give me a job because I'm brown, because again, that's not the same thing.
Yeah.
It's more about, look at these players, because not just because they're brown, but actually you're missing out like a seventh of the planet where there's a lot of talent. Not just India. I'm talking about other countries, and even in the different parts of the world. I'm not, again, India, just because that's my background. So I'm of course speaking for myself there, but it's just kind of weird, where it's like, hang on, I get there's visas problems and there's always different things in sport, and now coronavirus and Brexit don't help anything, but it's about looking at the players, and there's commercial value to it. And I think that's something as well we also bring up. Like, if we do have players who are Asian origin, we say, look, they're really good players, and at the end, then if they do get into the system, they say, oh, by the way, as part of our MO is, we also help brand these players. Like, one of our players has a brand deal with O'Neill's International Sports Group, in Ireland, and they see the value of not just having a player who's of that descent, but also just the value of the player in general. Like, he's a good player and happens to be Indian, and that's a great market for them to step into. So,
there's so much there I want to unpack. So
Sorry.
First off, like, representation, right? And so something that I always say is diversity is how we see each other, and inclusion is how we treat each other. And the way that people with certain descents or backgrounds are being seen is resulting in them being treated differently, than not giving them the access and opportunity necessarily to pursue their, pro football sports dreams, right? Because like that story you've shared, like, you were told, oh, you're just not big enough, like, what did that actually mean, right? If you had the ability to bulk up and get stronger, then like that was some like cop out excuse.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't look like how football players typically look, Parus. So just like, so stop dreaming this. You don't fit the bill, right? And so that's why that example and the work you do in the sponsorship and the brand deals are so important, because now there is someone of a certain look that typically has not had much representation in this field is now being represented, right? And so there's going to be kids and people who are playing football in the park, talking about where that linky pipeline occurs, like they're playing on the park and they're playing football, but then they don't go to that next level. It's because part of that reason is not seeing themselves and getting that implicit message from our society that, oh, well, if you look a certain way, then you can't compete in this space. Even though no one is saying that, we're being told that in all these different ways. And the work that you do, even though, yes, you want to, represent and support the best players, they still need to be phenomenal athletes. But at the end of the day, it's untapped potential, where, as you said, a seventh of the world population is not being looked at, coached, appreciated, valued, and it's untapped potential. It's commercial. There's commercial opportunity.
There's a value, and I think that's a really good point. Like I said, it's now, of course, so everyone wants to tap into different unknown markets now. It's like it's now happening, but again, without getting sort of criticizing people, there's too much of the virtue signaling that I see, where it's like, oh, we've got a school in India, so we're doing fine, or we have a deal with a team where we just give them coaches, that's fine, or we, it's not necessarily with the goal of actually let's see if it's good enough. If they're not good enough, not good enough. You know what I mean? It's happened in the early 2000s where a couple of the top Indian players from India came to the MLS. I think it was Kansas City Wizard. They were called Kansas City Wizard at the time. I forget the name. Before it was Sporting Kansas City, and they didn't quite work out, and that's fine. That's one player, right? And I think, just like anything, judging whole people on one person is essentially what the problem is. So it's I actually had that conversation with an executive in the US soccer space, and we had that argument. It was like, all right, it was just one person. And again, I'm not just saying just Indians, it's just everybody in sort of in the Asian sort of continent.
Yeah.
And again, not just that. And here's the thing. This is the funnier part is, the players that I work with, again, who happen to be of Asian origin, are all born and brought up in the Western, world, where it's like we've got a player in Denmark, we've got a player in England, we've got players in Canada here, and like I said, we have got players who aren't Asian. We've got players who are, European American, and working with players who are Caribbean descent, stuff like that. So it's not an issue. It's just one of those things where they're all in this. If that makes sense, they're all sort of coming from the same ilk in the sense that they're still born in this country, just having, different origin. But again, the culture is the same. Growing up playing football is the same. So it's like, when I play in England, I play like I played from England, not like I played from India, because I grew up in the English system.
Yeah.
So the only difference is that we necessarily didn't get the right advice or sought the right understanding of what it was to get better. And I'm not saying I could have made it or been better than anybody else. It's it's the most competitive, one of the most competitive sports in the world, industry in the world to go break into. And that's not what I'm saying. I think it's one of those things where, I had the opportunities, and you can argue that I may have not taken them when I was there. And it's one of those things where I didn't maybe not understand. Like, I used to run 5 miles or try to run long distance. Turns out that's a completely wrong thing to do. It turns out that it's about the sprinting. And, I was like 16 at the time. So now, we encourage all our players when we're doing the workouts with them and the regimes with them, it's to sprint and make sure you're doing short, explosive running, because that's what happens in soccer. You're not jogging around the field.
Yeah.
It's short sprints, and it's walks, and it's high intensity, and it's short. And, that does affect the way your body develops and adapts to the game. And then, I used to get upset, so I wasn't fitter and I was quite a fit kid, but not understanding why I wasn't not that fit. And I was actually why was I running 4 miles a day? Complete waste of my time. We were developing the wrong, functional muscles at that point, I guess. And again, I'm not sure that's the exact right terminology, so I apologize. But in terms of the fast twitch versus slow twitch, you're developing the slow twitch muscles rather than the fast twitch, which is what you need, in these explosive sports like football and basketball and so on and so forth.
But I think the point that you've made, and that's so applicable to not only what you do in your story, but like those doing diversity, equity, inclusion work as well, is that, you didn't have the same level of opportunity or coaching or guidance that you are now able to provide with the people that you work with, and
yeah,
your
for sure.
Yeah.
I'm still lucky to grow up with the opportunities I did have, in the sense that when I was picked up by today Bassett, his name is a very well-known English manager, and he's, to this day, he's like a sort of a mentor to me in a way, when I call him up every month, and in the football sense. And even with him, he was able to open the door for me. But again, when I'm walking through the door, if I'm sort of not at the level, which I wasn't in certain places in terms of the physical side, and that may have been true, but the pace was there, the technicality was there. I was having some fun, at the various clubs that I was at. And there was one club for sure that, due to like a misunderstanding of what to work out, which I'm explaining now, may have been a hindrance to me. But I think, again, if I had the understanding of this is what you got to do every day, and this is what you need to be worrying about, and this is the type of thing. And also it comes, and not to forget, one of the biggest problem we're forgetting is the mental side of things. Is that all that comes out, and obviously, particularly unfortunately, I had a very tough time dealing with the fact that I, thought I wasn't big enough, and that, I would hold that in, and you suffer mentally, because you think every time you make a mistake, you're doomed, and which is not true. And also on top of that, I used to take it upon myself. Again, it sounds a bit ridiculous, but take it upon myself to be the next Asian whatever superstar, which is, to me, I took that very seriously. In my head, everyone would joke about it, like, oh, he's talking about it. But in my head, I was like, yeah, this is it. Like, this is what I'm gonna do. And so every time I made a mistake, it was like a million times worse. Or if I did something wrong, it was a million times worse. If I got subbed off the field, it's a million times worse. So I would never forgive myself for doing those mistakes. When, I did tell, you don't tell family about it. And that's not just me, that's just a lot of players, not just in general, but specifically with my background, you have that issue where it's like, if we don't, we have to work. I think forget the phrase, but it's twice as hard to be considered equal. You have to work twice as hard to get half as much.
Yes, yes, yes.
So it's really, really difficult. So when
And
you're
that's so emotionally taxing and burdening.
training, yeah, absolutely.
How can you build that resilience when you're constantly having to work, twice as hard for half the amount of recognition and reward?
Yeah, and it's absolutely crazy. And I had like family friends who would joke with me saying you're the Indian David Beckham, and I loved that because it was like really funny. But then I would go, he's right. I have to
be this person. I need to be the best.
Right.
I'm representing this whole whole group. It's not,
and it wasn't just that. And the biggest thing for me was that I felt like I let my family down, because I was like, my mom and dad put so much into it. My siblings we dragged around me every day to go to football, and I was like, if I don't make it, this is the worst thing in the world, because they've sacrificed so much. You know what I mean? And that's also obviously families are families, but again, even culturally, we're very, very, very close family. Indian families are very, very close, and it was like, if it's not just me, it's all five of us. We're gonna kill it. It's gonna be great. So every time I do something wrong, or mess something up in the game, or maybe I missed a workout, or I overslept, it was like, oh my
it's a
God.
lot of pressure. It's a lot
which is all self-inflicted. Bear in mind.
Yeah.
Most of it, right? Most of it self-inflicted, because again, I've come to believe that pressure is pretty much just how we perceive and address this information, right?
Yeah.
Someone can scream at you all day long, but it doesn't register if you don't care. It's all self-inflicted. So that's the biggest problem. And I think part of, again, what we're trying to incorporate as well is sports psychology at some point, and hopefully have that, whereas not just me sort of ranting about my stories, because again, part of the reason we specialize in minority players is because we're able to empathize with each other a little bit and say, actually, this is really difficult. You're gonna have to deal with it, and it's something that is nice that I can empathize with, because then if they do play for teams and they do suffer these things that a European coach can't actually empathize, because they have no idea how to deal with it.
That's just so important. Representation is so
it's huge.
important. So especially at your level, at that executive level. And we just did a panel the other day on like the importance of executive level diversity and having that representation, and see yourself and the people who are leading and have the vision and have that empathy. And so I do want to ask a little bit, and we don't have to get totally into it, but I know.
Cut me off if I go off on a tangent.
Oh, no, you're great. So what role, or how do you strike the balance between fighting for racial justice, but not making the conversation only about race, right? So what role does eradicating racism play into the work you do, knowing that you also truly value the best of the best in players? There is elements of meritocracy. We can get into that conversation in another episode about meritocracy, but how do you strike this balance of, just wanting the best for your players as individuals, but also recognizing what you're doing, Parus, it really is helping to fight racism against certain types of players who want to be in this space? So how do you strike that balance?
It's really hard. I think just by existing as a brown person in the space, you're already doing that. There's not many.
Sorry, can you say that once more for the people in the back? That was so powerful.
Well, just existing as a brown person in this space is already sort of fighting that battle. I think there are other agents who are like myself, and who are Indian or Pakistani origin or whatever. But specifically with what I'm doing, we talk to Premier League clubs and MLS clubs, and and so on and so forth. And it is a lot harder. Not just being. I think that it's not harder because we're in one brown. It's harder just because we're younger and newer and different, and we're breaking into a space with 5 or 6 or 7 big franchises. But I don't know. I mentioned to you probably previously on another call, one of our chats, that I really don't. I try not to think about it, in the sense that when I'm coming to teams and trying to discuss players, I don't really bring up where they're from. Like I said, we work with players who are Caribbean background, European American background, Asian descent, whatever. So you're bringing it across that they're footballers. That's it. And you have to keep pushing that narrative. because that's what, because if you bring up the fact that they're brown, it comes across as like you're a charitable, oh, it's just he's brown and he's just doing this thing and that's
Or we
nice.
get into like tokenism, like, oh, you can add a brown player to your team.
Yeah. And it's like,
Pat yourself on the back. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I don't need that. I don't think anybody needs that. I don't think we need to be given anything. I think it's one of those things we don't, it's not about being given an extra slot in the boardroom just for a brown person or, you know,
Or
or whatever, you know what I mean? And again, it's not that, it's just about, let's just look at them as footballers. That's all I'm asking. And that's what we're doing. And like, again, I happen to be Indian. I happen to really like, you know, I'm Punjabi, you know, Indian. I happen to be brown and a big beard, and I happen to have a lot of Asian origin players. And it is, but that's what it is. You know, our ulterior motives are our own. Like, I don't need to reveal to the world what my ulterior motives are. And I have many different motives. That's what I'm doing. But when it comes to football and soccer and sports world, they are athletes.
yes.
That's it. So when we look at them athletes, I discuss where they fit in the right formation, what their physicality is, what their ability on the ball is. We talk all about football. And if they happen to be, get to a point where they say, by the way, listen, if even then, I'm uncomfortable with that, because one of those things where, you know, actually, weirdly enough, the very first time I again, I'm not sure exactly what the feeling is, I describe it, but the very first time I saw this movie, weirdly enough, it's called Like Mike with Bow Wow back in like 2003.
Mm-hmm.
It's about an 8-year-old kid who finds his magic Jordans, and he starts becoming this amazing basketball player. He's like 5 foot nothing.
Yeah.
And they sign him just to sign it. Right. And that was the first time. And he was like, and they asked, he's like, am I just here for a payday? Am I just here for show?
Yeah.
And then they play him and he loses his powers and he still plays really well or whatever. And it works out in the movie. But that's kind of the first ever time I understood that concept of the tokenism thing.
Yeah.
Right. And I was like 9, 7, 8. I don't remember when I came out, but it was young. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. I see what you're saying. That's really funny. Like, I'm thinking excited because he's really good. And they weren't playing him. And I was like really disappointed. And that's essentially what I'm trying to avoid. I don't need people to make slots for me. I mean, all I'm, you know, make exceptions, you know, the Rooney Rule has its problems, right? Like I think I read something where there were 3 black head coaches in 2002 or 3 when it came into play, and as of 2020, there's still only 3 black coaches. So it doesn't. The forcing the problem is not going to help. It's just about looking at every candidate as equal. Like when you look at a resume, you don't know what color they are. So,
well, actually,
you know what I mean? You can guess maybe from the name where they're from.
You can guess the name, and a best practice is stripping names out of resumes so that bias doesn't hold true.
I mean, that's a good. I mean, maybe again, that's a good or bad solution, but you know, again, maybe it's just myself and people like myself who've grown up, you know, friends in the entrepreneurial space, friends in various large companies and stuff like that, and that's how we probably handle things, but. It's maybe because we're used to it and we understand the value of not worrying about where they're from. I'm not saying European Americans don't. I'm just saying that the minority who are ruining it for everybody else are it's just again, we could probably talk about this for like 4 hours, but it's just the overall issue for me is that for me there's no balance. You are just doing what you're doing. You're breaking the space. You're developing relationship with people who, and again, talking about working twice as much to get half or whatever recognition is that, you know, I have to prove that I know more about soccer than anybody else. I have to know every formation or every time I'm talking to a player. I can't drop an ounce of research when I'm talking to different teams, you know, and so that also helps when they know that I know what I'm talking about. And that's that's the only way I see it happening. And again, I'm not saying it's fun, and without obviously this exists in the business, but there needs to be more of us doing things in the space where again we're working, like I said, thousands of times, 100%. We worked with, you know, we have right now majority Asian players for sure, because it's just when they see my face or see the logo, they're like, oh my god, that's really cool. Like he's working for us. No, of course we work with anybody. Like I said, European Americans, Asians, Africans, doesn't matter to me. I don't really I don't care. If you're a good player, any good mentality, I'll help you. That's essentially what we're doing. And if you happen to be someone who speaks my language or, you know, is from the same culture, amazing. We have more to talk about.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you are footballers, and that's exactly how we pitch to the clubs.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how we're going to treat you, and exactly how we're going to get mad at you, and how we're going to advise you, because that's what you are. And the more you do that, I think, the better. The more we keep talking about ways to include people and always virtue signaling rubbish, it's not going to help. And there are schemes in England that have come out, particularly that I'm not going to get into, that are tick box exercises, and it doesn't help. It's like the whole problem with the space, in not just in England but in Europe and in around the world, right? And there's various prejudices around the world, is that we're not looking at these players as players. That's what I'm asking. That's honestly what it is. Just look at those players. If they're rubbish, and that's the thing. That's why I'm attached to the players when I go anywhere they are. I watch them play. And we had this problem where I took a player to a team in the MLS, and he didn't get it. He didn't get the contract, and I was really disappointed. I was like, in my head, I thought, it's because he's brown. Then I watched him play at the next team I took him to, and I was like, actually, he isn't as good as everybody else. I can accept that.
Yeah.
100%.
But something that's so important of what that example that you just shared, and then I want to wrap up with 3 points of how we can stay out of tokenism whenever we're doing work that has that racial lens. And so that example you just shared, right? Like, you did question though if it was a race-based decision, right? You did.
Yeah.
Having that lens and having that opportunity to question that, and then the fact that you had the data to go back and see, oh no, we actually didn't play as good as some of the other players, but at least being there to challenge that, and being there to at least like ask those questions, because the reason why unconscious bias is so rampant is because we don't challenge these things. We don't have these conversations. And so 3 ways to mitigate tokenism that I heard you talking about, Parus. First off, focus on skills. Focus on what players or what these employees or leaders or fill in the blank, what these people are bringing to the table, and have that lead the conversation. Have that lead the decision-making process.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so that's point 1. Point 2, though, is still have that self-awareness of the fact that this person is from an underrepresented group, is absolutely dealing with additional barriers that are making it more challenging to break into this space. And so you as a leader, not just you Parus, but you watching out there as leaders, knowing that we need to be sponsors, be mentors, be talking about people with the skills and the abilities and the experiences people bring to the table, while also in the back of our minds being aware this person's probably going to face extra challenges and unnecessary barriers and burdens in this space because of who they are and not what they do.
Yeah, exactly. So, and no, just adding the point, I think sort of it's in your interest to adhere to the individuals who work in your company, to look after them. It is in your interest. I don't care about, just make this money. It's about money making. It's essentially, it's in your interest to help the people already in your company, in your organization. Yes, you can fire them for not very good a job, but if they're doing a good job, it's in your interest to make them do a better job.
And to help them stay.
Exactly. You don't want to turn over some great family.
Valued, respected, seen, and heard. And I feel like the third and final point about how to avoid tokenism and to really do this work while just running a good business or doing a good job is representation, right? How can we continue to support and amplify and work with and partner with organizations, with leaders that are defying the norms of what a typical leader in this space looks like. So I know I work with a lot of my clients on how can they diversify their vendor pool and the businesses that they partner with, that they work from, that they get resources from. And I feel like the point you made earlier in our conversation about, how you just being in this space as, a person of color, the representation you have, having more role models, having that brand example of one of your players, and that now there's going to be a whole new generation seeing themselves and what a football player looks like. I feel like that's so important. Parus, this has been amazing. How do people get in touch with you? How can people follow along on your journey?
So LinkedIn, email. I think if I just I guess on my email maybe posted on wherever the post would be, and email and LinkedIn, probably the best ways. I'm usually checking them all the time. And my Instagram isn't great, but you can try me on Instagram as well. But 100%, we have on our website, nischalsports.com, we have like a form and email fill out, and it comes directly to me usually. So I usually respond to that very quickly. So, I'm always willing to chat about this sort of thing. And again, anyone wants help in football, that's, we're here to help. So
Thank you for helping us all be better humans at work.